So we're happy to have with us again Michael Mehaffy. Michael is a noted scholar of Alexander's work, former student and colleague. He taught at various graduate institutions in many countries, and he's author of several books that are related to Alexander's work, including a new pattern language for growing regions, places, networks, and processes, which came out, I think, a couple of years ago. Cities Alive on Christopher Alexander, Jane Jacobs, and the Roots of the New Urban Renaissance. And he also edited and contributed to the 50th anniversary edition of A City Is Not a Tree, to which I also contributed something. And he's been organizing the last conferences of the International Making Cities Livable movement, and where the last one we were also people from Building Beauty have organized a workshop in the conference that was last October in Dorchester and Poundbury, and he just off from finishing a conference in Newport. And so one of our students requested a lecture on relationship between Alexander and Whitehead, and I said, who's the better person to do that than Michael? And Michael, notwithstanding his busy schedule, has agreed immediately and is here. So please, Michael.
Thank you, Yodan. So I'm delighted to talk about both Christopher Alexander and another fascinating person, and I think important person for similar reasons, Alfred North Whitehead. And there's a lot of overlap between them, as I'll discuss, a lot of complementarity and different emphasis that they have. Chris, of course, was more sort of focused on how you apply the philosophy. He was a kind of applied philosopher, you might say, who wanted to know how to build things. And as I said in the abstract, we're going to look at those parallels and the parallel particularly between Whitehead's process philosophy, the philosophy of how things change and how the world is a dynamic place of evolution and so on, and Chris's ideas of adaptive morphogenesis, very similar idea. And both of them upend this idea that the universe is a kind of dead place where living structures have somehow sort of arisen out of these mechanistic processes, which is kind of an exceptional phenomenon that isn't really part of the nature of things, almost a freakish phenomenon in a way. But they find evidence for a universe that is suffused with life, with the sort of primordial qualities of life in which more and more organized forms of life arise. And that's true for Alexander, even in the buildings and spaces that we humans make. They can have degrees of life, even in a literal sense, not just a metaphorical sense. And so what I think you'll see, I hope you'll see out of this talk, is that Alexander is not out of left field. He really is part of a long tradition, along with Whitehead, and even an ancient tradition of process philosophy, going back even before to the ancient Greeks. Whitehead is famous for saying that the history of Western philosophy can be summarized as a series of footnotes to Plato. And Plato was known as an idealist. There is some transcendent structure beyond the world that we see, and that's the ideal, the eidos, or the idea or the form, and then the real world is simply a manifestation of that. And that tension between idealism and realism goes all the way through the history of Western philosophy, and the tension between meaning and structure, mind and body, spirit and matter, wholes and parts, and so on. And what I think is interesting is not that, well, we're going to take one view or the other, but that we're going to understand how those two aspects of reality are interconnected, intertwined in some important way that we need to understand. And there's an idea that both Whitehead and Alexander are neo-structuralists. They see the world as a structure and the world of meaning as a structure. Those are not opposite to each other. They're actually two sides of the same coin. They're symmetrically related to one another. And language is symmetrically related to our the world that we're interested in, that we're representing through our language. And that is a very powerful idea. Language is a structure in the world, just like the structures in the world that it refers to, but it's the way that we use those in a sort of symmetric relationship that gives language its power, its generativity, and its importance in the world of culture, but also rooted in nature. There's a language-like aspects even to the way the DNA code works, for example. So we'll talk about all that in a little bit. And we'll talk about the fact that language is not only generative, it's also capable of creating confusions, right? We can get trapped in our language. Whitehead referred to the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, where we mistake the concepts of language for the reality to which they refer, the other reality, because language is a reality in its own right. And so we have to battle against this bewitchment, as Wittgenstein put it, this bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language. And that's a wonderful double entendre, because it's language that gets us into this trouble, but it's only language that can get us out of this trouble. So we have to sort of constantly work our way through and battle against this bewitchment and this misplaced concreteness, as Whitehead put it. And we have to ground ourselves in our own bodies and our own world, as Alexander would say, and continually, rediscover the I in ourselves, the inner being, the inner world, the world of nature, essentially. And Alexander did talk about Whitehead this is in book 3, where he talks about the picture of the world that has sort of bifurcated, as Whitehead put it, the world of mechanism and the world of experience. And we need to bring these two pictures together into a unified single picture of the world. And both Whitehead and Alexander believed this. And indeed, we need to understand it as a fundamental grounding of everything else that we do, because otherwise we're trapped in this machine-like way of looking at the world and way of organizing the world, which is creating many, many dangers and destructive outcomes. In fact, we're destroying ourselves, I think, is a very simple way of putting it, if we don't resolve this problem. So this is fundamentally important to get clear. And the related aspect of that is that value, the sense of importance, the sense of the I, the sense of what matters to us is central to everything we're going to talk about for both Whitehead and Alexander. That, again, this is not something separate from the physical world. This is something that is the other side of the coin of what we see in the physical structures of the world. So he certainly has a debt to Whitehead, and there's certainly many parallels to Whitehead, which I'll tease out in a little more detail. So a little bit about Whitehead. He was a mathematician, and then became a philosopher, became a very noted philosopher, really considered the founder of modern process philosophy. The idea of process philosophy goes back even before the pre-Socratics, Heraclitus and others. But in his, reformulation of this idea, it's gotten richer and more elaborated, and has had influence in many fields, influenced many other people, including Alexander. He's sometimes thought of as a difficult thinker, but partly that's because his ideas are abstract. He's talking about abstraction, so you can't avoid being abstract when you're talking about abstractions. And if you understand that he's using familiar words in a more primal sense, words like importance and possibility and organism and so on, he becomes much easier to read, I think. Process and Reality is probably his best known book, but also a very dense book where he lays out his cosmology, essentially his metaphysics of how he thinks the universe is maybe organized. And there's some striking parallels to Alexander on that too that I'll get to. But another book that I think you all will enjoy, and I certainly enjoy, it's one of my favorite books, not only of his, but of any book, is Modes of Thought, where he tries to unpack these confusions of our thinking and tries to get at the root of them, and does that very well, I think. He was very famous for working with his former student, Bertrand Russell, on a volume called Principia Mathematica, where they sought to establish the fundamental logic behind all of mathematics, the sort of fundamental structure of all mathematics, almost like a blueprint that would account for every proposition in mathematics. There was a fly in the ointment, though, interestingly enough, when along comes Kurt Gödel, who wrote a paper in 1931 where he showed essentially that this is actually impossible, that no system can be complete, as he referred to it. In other words, no mathematical system, no linguistic system, no representative system can completely represent any other system, because it can always be essentially self-contradictory. It can be the equivalent of the Epimenides paradox, or the liar's paradox, where if you say this statement is false, if this statement is false, then it must be true. You're claiming that it's true. But if it's true, it says it's false. So how can it be true and false at the same time, right? And so what Gödel did is he essentially took the mathematical equivalent of this statement is false and used it in the Principia Mathematica system to create an untenable paradox, and therefore to show that the whole system of Principia Mathematica was untenable, that it was not achieving its goal of being a complete representation of mathematics. And by extension, we can understand that incompleteness is a property of all linguistic systems ultimately, but an important component, because linguistic systems need to be incomplete in order to represent the world effectively. If we had a totally complete picture of the world, it would be just as confusing as the world itself. It wouldn't reveal to us anything about the world. As Whitehead put it, an abstraction is nothing else than an omission of part of the truth. And that's the way it works. That's why it is an abstraction. That's why it's useful. So this is a shameless plug of my own recent book, where I took that idea of incompleteness and applied it to some of our current predicaments, and trying to understand how these challenges are playing out in our world today, including our world of architecture. And I talked about Alexander and Whitehead and a number of others. So I think there's a lot to unpack there, and I hope that I've begun to do that in this volume, and certainly will try to do that in this talk. So let's go back to Whitehead and to others who are in similar philosophical tradition. I mentioned this quote from Whitehead before, that the European philosophical tradition consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. Plato's idealism, right? You all may perhaps know the allegory of the cave, this idea that we're kind of like people who are chained to a wall in a cave, and we're looking at the flickering light coming from a fire behind us, and all we see is the shadows. And for Plato, that was all we saw. But we could learn through higher levels of knowledge the reality of what is causing the fire behind us, through natural science, through deductive mathematics, through geometry and logic, and through his own theory of forms. And that was his idea of idealism, or eidos, or forms, the ideas of idealism. And it's similar in some ways to Pythagoras's theory of numbers, that the universe, there's a fundamental reality of numbers that transcends specific numbers. I can talk about 3 fingers, or 3 books, or 3 this or 3 that, but the threeness is something that fundamentally underlies all of those things. But Aristotle comes along and he says, well, no, we have to understand that there is an immanent realism in the world. We have to be grounded in the actual world as it exists. He rejected Plato's theory of forms, but he accepted some of the ideas behind it. Instead of thinking of the world of forms and the world of matter as separate, Aristotle saw them as overlapping in some direct way, in a way that's very close to Alexander, in an interesting relationship, because essentially what Aristotle was arguing is that every physical object is a compound of matter and form. The matter creates the form, And it not only creates the form, but then it becomes matter at the next scale, and then creates the form at the next scale, and creates the form at the next scale, and so on. So if you think about the letters that are the matter of syllables, and the syllables are the matter of words, and words of paragraphs, and paragraphs, etc. And just like the brick becomes the matter of a building, and the building becomes the form of the neighborhood, and the neighborhood is the matter that becomes the form of a city, and so on and so on and so on, these sort of nested relationships. That's Aristotle's idea of hylomorphism, as it's called. And you'll notice that it's very similar to Alexander's idea of patterns, because if you think about the screws and hinges of a door that become part of the door, and then the door becomes part of a room, and the room becomes part of a house, and so on, it's a very similar kind of relationship. But the key issue here, the key point I want to make, is that ancient ideas can sometimes undergo a revival in a new context. An example is how Plato's idea of forms has been reborn in a way in the modern concept of an attractor, or you may be familiar with a strange attractor, or a attractor basin, which is a mathematical idea. A little bit abstract, but it's easy to understand through this example. Imagine a beach, okay? And there's an ice cream stand that sets up on the beach selling ice cream to everybody. So it draws from all sides of the beach. Everybody's happy. The ice cream vendor makes a good living, and so on. Now, a second ice cream stand comes along. Where does it go? Well, the logical thing would be to say, okay, each one of you goes to half of the beach, you get half of the beach, everybody's happy, and that's what's going to happen. But that's not what happens, because what happens is the second ice cream stand says, oh, look what I can do. I can go right here. And now I don't have half the beach, I have 3/4 of the beach, and the other guy gets 1/4 or whatever, right? So they both know this. They both know that this is what's going to happen. And therefore, what do? They go right to the middle. And that is the attractor. That is the logical structure of where the attraction point is, of where they're going to end up on the beach. Now, this is a real dynamic in the real structure of things. This is not some transcendent esoteric realm or occult realm that is influencing reality. It is reality. It is an aspect of reality that is embodied in the physical world. So this is the structuralist idea that we're talking about here, that it's grounded in the reality of our world. It's a really real structure arising from the dynamics of the interactions of the elements themselves. So it's embodied, imbued in the world. And this is what, by the way, what a pattern is. A pattern is an attractor, right? It's a series of elements that come into a stable form of a relationship, strong forces, if you remember from your pattern logic, the idea that they are clustered together in some critical way. So again, ancient ideas get reborn in new ways, and perhaps with new understanding of how maybe you don't need a separate realm. All you need is the understanding of the structural dynamics that are going on in the nature of things. So you're seeing this throughout history, I think, ancient philosophical concepts that get reborn in new contexts with added insights and aspects, and get enriched and get deepened and get transformed over time, and we all benefit from that. Now let's go back again to Whitehead and to others who have picked up that thread of, recognizing the ancient discourse, the ancient dialectic of idealism and realism and nature and life and structure and so on. So what he does in Process and Reality is he proposes a speculative metaphysics that the universe is not made of things, but of occasions that are transforming and creating stable entities, actual entities, as he calls them, but they're really occasions that are happening all around us. And this is very similar to what's going on in quantum physics, for example. He was very influenced by quantum physics and the idea that, there are these sort of configurations that are going on that are holistic in nature, and that they are both part of a larger system, and also they're concentrated. They're the waves that are interconnected with everything that's going on around them, these holistic phenomena, and then they're also concentrated into these little particle-like structures that are these nodes within the waves, if you will. So he embraces the idea of a wave-particle duality. And in Modes of Thought, which, as I said, is really a great book that I highly recommend and very much more readable. It's actually a series of 9 lectures. What he argues is that, look, language isn't some esoteric realm of a deep occult that needs to be revealed to us in some way. And it's not just a random construction that we make either. It starts with the presuppositions of our lives. It starts with the kind of onomatopoeias of, whoa, look at that. Wow, look at, and hey, look, here's something important. It starts with our presuppositions as beings in the world who are calling attention to things and calling attention to the relationship of things and the interconnections of things, and then regenerating new possible reconnections of things, the architecture of possibility, if you will. So here are the 9 lectures that he gives, or actually gave these lectures in public, and then he developed them into the book project. Essentially, his point is that we need to get the relationship of language to reality right. Not some fundamental linguistic system, but language grows out of our experience and our sense of importance. And if we understand that, then we can use language more effectively. And what we call matter, for example, is what matters to us. If I push on my finger and it matters to my finger that I can't push through, that's what matters, and that's why we talk about that it is matter. It wouldn't be matter if we didn't experience it as something that matters in a deep sense. But our current framework of knowledge fails to recognize this. Our built-up framework that we sort of jumped into and pretended that that's the reality, that is just a sort of dead mechanistic world. But actually, it's a world that we ourselves are embedded in. That, remember Heisenberg's observer principle. And he's talking about a bad attack of muddle-headed positivism, which arbitrarily applies its doctrine and arbitrarily escapes from it. The whole doctrine of life and nature has suffered from this positivist taint, he says. And we're told that, we just need the physical and chemical formulae and that the process of nature, there's nothing else. We've got the final blueprint of reality in our abstractions. Whitehead says this is a very wrong, muddle-headed idea. It doesn't understand what abstractions actually are. Remember, he says they're an omission of part of the truth. Neither physical nature nor life can be understood unless we fuse them together as essential factors in the composition of really real things whose interconnections and individual characters constitute the universe. That's the neo-structuralist view of things, or the symmetric structuralist view of things, you might call it. And if we don't do that, then we're in danger of committing the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, of falling into the trap of the bifurcation of nature, seeing facts and values as separate, quantitative and qualitative as separate, nature lifeless versus nature alive, and so on. And this is something that we need to guard against and think deeply about, understand the deeper connectivity. This is what philosophy can do. Philosophy is the critic of abstractions. Its functions is not just to say, oh, well, that's the way it is, we need to understand this, but really understand it. Harmonize these abstractions, assigning to them the right relative status as abstractions, and secondly, completing them by direct comparison with more concrete intuitions, always having that intimate dance between the reality and the abstraction, coupling them closely. You see that in Alexander, by the way, the idea that our ideas about building need to be directly rooted in the process of building, and not, we can't go off and do it from an office somewhere remotely. We need the promotion of the formation of more complete schemes of thought that are more intimately connected to the world. And he says the final conclusion from the discussions included in this course of lectures is the importance of a right adjustment of the process of abstractions. We humans are distinguished from animal life by our emphasis on abstractions, but abstraction goes on in all throughout nature. It's just a matter of the amount of use of abstraction and the emphasis of abstraction. And then he says the degeneracy of mankind is distinguished from its uprising by the dominance of chill abstractions, divorced from aesthetic content. Or you could say providing our own artificial or synthetic aesthetic content. which might be okay in limited context, but not if we lose contact with our own realities as beings in the world. And I think both Whitehead and Alexander are fierce critics of modernity for having erected a project that loses contact with our own realities as beings in the world and traps us in a new world that is very damaging because it allows this dominance of chill abstractions divorced from aesthetic content, from the natural aesthetic content, at least. And that, again, is what I explored in this book, the idea that, and I think you see this in Whitehead, certainly, and then to some degree in Alexander, that language is indeed a generator of reality. It is a form of reality in its own right, but it also creates an architecture of possibility that through the use of our language, through the manipulation of the structures of language, we can generate possibilities, and therefore we can generate choices, and we can generate ethical dilemmas. Can I do this? Can I do that? And this creates great richness and complexity in our lives and the adventure of ideas, but we have to be careful how we do that. You know, if we think about an asteroid striking the Earth, we wouldn't say that's evil, even though maybe it wipes out humanity. But if a human being created some kind of, super virus that wiped out humanity, we would say that person is evil. Why do we say that about one and not the other? Well, because the human being has language and choice and ethics and the ability to see the world and understand the consequences of their choices and their choosing, we would say wrongly, from the point of view of human interest, right? Human value. They're creating damage. They're creating evil. So this is, I think, an important sort of philosophical point of understanding how language itself is really the generator of choices and of human choice, free will, if you will, and ethical choices and all the other things. This is also a thorny problem throughout philosophy that I think can be sorted out in just this way. And again, going back to Wittgenstein and this wonderful message about philosophy is the battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language. It's language that gets us into the trouble, but language that has to get us out of the trouble. Now, let's talk a little more about Alexander. It's now about 30 minutes into the talk, and I'm going to focus a little more on how Alexander relates to all this. Many of you know he was a student of physics and mathematics at Cambridge University, then went to Harvard, and always had one overriding concern: the relationship between the parts and the wholes, the parts of a city, the parts of a building, the parts of a design problem, and how they did or didn't form functional, beautiful wholes. And this is the idea known in philosophy as mereology, the relationship between parts and their respective wholes. And it's something that certainly is a central concern of Whitehead's as well. Around the time that Alexander was working, there was a lot of work about the world of complexity and the cybernetic age and so on. And Herbert Simon, for example, who was a polymath and one of the pioneers of the cybernetic era, described the architecture of complexity as being a nearly decomposable series of hierarchies. Remember Aristotle's hylomorphism here. And Alexander, in Notes on the Synthesis of Form, made the same observation with one very important addition. He noted that they aren't perfectly decomposable. You remember that Simon talked about near decomposability, and that near turns out to be really important. It's the clusters and the web-like relationships, the overlap, that create the richness of the structures and the complexity of the structures that we need to understand. And this is essential to the understanding of the parts of a problem to its whole, whether the parts make the whole makes the parts. Do the leaves make the tree? No, the tree makes the leaves, right? How does this work in nature? How does it work in human technology? What are we doing wrong, perhaps? What new tools and approaches does this suggest? And then A City is Not a Tree, which is a paper that he wrote the following year after publishing Notes on the Synthesis of Form. He described this overlap and this important quality of beyond a sort of tree-like relationship or simple hierarchical relationship, where you could have, for example, even in a simple example of a drugstore, a traffic light, a newspaper rack, and there's a kind of rock, paper, scissors relationship between them. It's not a simple hierarchical relationship where one thing is above the other two. They're all in this sort of nested web-like relationship. And cities are full of these relationships, he says, or natural cities are. And artificial cities that people were planning at that time are not full of these relationships. Again, misplaced concreteness, perhaps. We're over-reifying, we're over-structuring in a very rigid tree-like way. We need to understand the enormity of this restriction. If we make tree-like structures, it's as if your members of your family were not free to make friends outside the family unless the whole family made friends with the other whole family, and so on. And this is not a simpler or less orderly structure, but more so. It's a thicker, tougher, more subtle, and more complex view of structure, he says. And this echoes what Jane Jacobs was talking about when she talked about organized complexity. Many of you are familiar with that argument, I'm sure, but we haven't, even in 1961, and I would argue in 2024, still understood and treated cities as problems of organized complexity. And organized here, by the way, is in the Whiteheadian sense, the organic qualities, the holistic qualities of complexity, of complex systems like a city. And we've consistently treated cities and buildings and other structures around us, basically the structures of our world, as simple tree-like structures instead of the web-like structures that Alexander described. And of course, a pattern language was really a method for creating a more web-like, less tree-like structure, a more interconnected pattern-like structure, language-like structure, indeed, a pattern language, as you're all familiar with. Teasing out this web-like structure that's so essential to reality, to the process and reality going on around us. And a pattern is a real thing. I said that before, and I just want to emphasize that the hinges and the knob are all in an attractor relationship or a strong force relationship with each other. If you have the hinges on the same side as the knob, the door isn't going to open, right? So you need that essential relationship between the parts. And then the parts at the next scale become the holes at the next scale become the parts at the next scale become the holes, and so on and so on and so on, and build up the structures of our world. Again, the hylomorphism of Aristotle, but with this new wrinkle, this overlap, this essential web-like relationship or organized complexity. And as you all know, pattern languages get built up. They build up real things going on in the world. There's this non-tree-like relationship, this interconnected web-like relationship, even though it's nearly decomposable, it's roughly hierarchical, right? And then you all know the iconic structure, I think. There's a title, there's an iconic photo, upward hyperlinks, problem statement, analysis, diagrammatic conclusion, and downward hyperlinks, and so on, forming this networked web-like relationship of for example, the hyperlinks form this web-like relationship, and the citations form a web-like relationship. And again, we see eternal ideas being reapplied. Aristotle's hylomorphism, Heraclitus's ideas of process, even Plato's idea of the attractor or the eidos, but a little bit put in a bit of a different context. Now, I'm going to talk just briefly, in the time I have left, about the nature of order, because what Alexander recognized after completing a pattern language is that he had not talked enough about the ability to customize the patterns. It was hard to interface with conventional modern systems and methods. And even more important to him, there was not information about form and geometry in order to make a beautiful structure. The structures that were being made were very personal, they were idiosyncratic, but they were not beautiful in some essential way that Alexander understood was necessary. The beauty was a recognition of their wholeness or their deep interconnectedness. So the nature of order was a 25-year project to remedy those shortcomings, to operationalize the insights that he made, and understanding that this is not only Alexander's understanding, but the understanding of the changing scientific picture of the world. As he said, there are a lot of people that are working in parallel, as he says in the introduction to book 3. He talks about the evolution of quantum physics and the fact that, like in quantum physics, there are practical applications. In the sphere of building, we wish to create living structure in the built world. We wish to apply this model of the universe in order to reproduce the phenomena that we are interested in: life, quality, beauty, enhancement of living. These are direct experiential things. These are not abstractions. We use abstractions to describe them, perhaps. And again, there's a strong component with quantum physics, as he describes here, and with biology and other fields. It gives a shout out to Schrodinger and Bohm and Roger Penrose, Prigogine, Mandelbrot, the fractal guy, Brian Goodwin, the biologist, John Holland, Stuart Kaufman, another biologist, Mei-Wan Ho, and others. So he is anchoring himself in a tradition of thinkers who are recognizing this new scientific picture of the world. And as I showed before, giving a nod to Whitehead and the idea that we need to end this bifurcation of nature. We need to understand what Whitehead was saying. And furthermore, what is the intimate relationship between structure and meaning, and the I that we experience in our world, the primordial experience of life and value and meaning, and the structure that we observe in the world. These are not separate things. They're intimately connected. So he asked basically in The Nature of Order, how does nature achieve the order that we see? It doesn't make little blueprints or, perfect little abstractions. It makes something more like codes or recipes that generate form, that create morphogenesis. And the results are complex, adaptive, and emergent. And we can learn from these processes. We can incorporate them. We've done so in the past and still do so now, but we have a lot more work to do to improve our state of affairs. A couple of quick summary ideas I'll go over briefly, and then we can have some discussion. Many of you may know some of these ideas of centers, but what I want to point out is the similarity to Whitehead here and his actual entities. The idea that space can be understood as a field of centers, as an interconnected, internested set of relationships, an overlapping set of relationships. These are particular identified sets that have noticeable distinctness, but are not fundamentally separate from what's happening around them. Again, similar to what's going on in quantum physics with particles and waves. And the centers help each other in a sense. I've shown this example before. This is Penelope Cruz. And you can see the centers, the very complex nested centers, say, in a part of her face. And if you take those away, you get something very disturbing, this very sort of dead, doll-like structure. But if you put them back in, you can see the wholeness emerging, the life emerging, right, from the interrelationship of these centers. They are not static. They are transforming over time, and the structure is preserving, or the wholeness is being enhanced through these transformations, as in this milk drop, where the wholeness of a sphere shatters when it hits a milk plane, but it doesn't turn into a disordered mess. It turns into new structures. This is a very important idea of symmetric structuralism, the idea that symmetry breaking creates new symmetries and new structures with a series of consistent geometric properties that Alexander describes. He calls them the 15 properties that he's able to distill out of these kinds of processes that are emergent all around the world, and including in traditional architecture, levels of scale. Those are the fractal ideas, boundaries, strong centers, local symmetries. And symmetry is something that underlies all of these ideas in a very interesting way. I don't have time to get all the way into that subject because I want to wrap it up here, but these are properties also of aesthetic phenomena that we experience when we look at a natural environment or a traditional environment. They spontaneously are generated through these processes, through these transformations of sets of centers that go on over time. And again, this is Whitehead talking about the starting point was our intuition of spatial volumes and how one volume may contain or extend over another, the overlap idea, the nested idea, alternating repetition, levels of scale, boundaries, all these things. There's a lot here that's very similar to 15 properties if you look carefully. And I'm just going to close on this note, which is some work I've been doing recently with our friend Nikos Salingaros on symmetry, which we think needs needs a reassessment, very overdue in architecture. And it's not simply the left and right idea that's sort of the dumbed down version of symmetry. Symmetry is a very profound, a very powerful idea, not only right and left, rotational, translational, scaling or fractal, and then compound versions of those, the kaleidoscope or the fractal patterns of nature and so on, and the tiling patterns, very complex patterns that underlie a lot of mathematics, geometry, Islamic patterns, beautiful tiling patterns there, etc. And what you might refer to as deep symmetries, the symmetries that form between us and our world, where we see another human being or a sculpture that we find beautiful, or a landscape that we find beautiful, or a building in the landscape that we find beautiful. All these are very profound. And this was a paper that another colleague wrote, several colleagues actually, taking this idea of deep symmetry that Nikos and I wrote about, that is something that he saw in the Islamic architecture of a particular building in Pakistan. Quite an interesting idea, I think. So again, I'll leave you with this idea that symmetry and symmetry breaking is a fundamental ordering property in the universe, ordering action in the universe that gives rise to these properties. This is the process and reality that Whitehead talks about, the actual entities, the actual occasions that are emerging through and arising through the process. That is also the process of we ourselves and our own natural world as it transforms and becomes more patterned and more beautiful. And this is, again, Whitehead's idea that nature is alive. It is not lifeless. We can see that these are the really real interconnections of things that constitute the universe, that are the structure within space, and that gives rise to making space come alive. All of these structures have something in common, which is that they are structures that bring life to the universe, bring life to our world around us, and they are rooted in the very nature of space itself. DNA is a kind of code that, again, generates possibilities. The actions that we take generate possibilities, and they can be terrible, they can be cancerous, or they can be something profound and beautiful. And this is the world that we know and love in a place like Venice. So what's the difference? What generates life versus death? What generates wholeness versus fragmentation? What generates strong value versus weak value? These are the questions that Alexander asks, and that Whitehead asks in some degree. And Alexander answers that it's stepwise growth according to rules and processes, but it's the right rules and processes, the ones that generate life and wholeness, that have these web-like interconnections. It's not the wrong kinds of rules and processes, which is what our world is cluttered up with today, clogged with, that is generating this horrible tangle that is going to destroy us if we don't get a handle on it. This mechanical approach to growth that is working very well in a way, dangerously well, in a sort of viral way or cancerous way, exploiting economies of scale and standardization, which are very real, by the way. But we need economies of place and differentiation as well to balance those. We need to integrate all of those together if we're going to have a living world that is going to survive. We need to recognize the weaknesses within modernity and the modern mechanical model, and understand the changing view of modernity that's emerging from people like Jane Jacobs and like Christopher Alexander. And I'll just flip through these slides right now as I'm wrapping up. But the understanding of how beautiful structures arise, and they're not just planned through blueprints that are built later. You couldn't do that with these structures, these beautiful structures that exist in the world. They have to generate, they have to be alive in order to have the beauty and the wholeness and the characteristics that they have. And that's true for human processes, for creating a birch bark canoe out of what looks like a disordered mess, but gradually is formed and shaped and enriched. And the same thing is true with built environments as well. Rosetown in Jamaica, informal settlements that have their innate structures, innate beauties, and we need to understand them. We need to understand how these structures form and become more beautiful over time. And that's a good note, I think, to end on, because we're going to talk about that when we go to Cortona, Italy. How did the informality, the lifelike processes as well as some of the top-down processes, the officials and the governance that they had, generate these beautiful structures that we see in a place like Tuscany. So let's talk about that in Cortona. It's late October, early November. If you are interested, I hope many of you will come and we'll have a chance to have a Building Beauty session there. On that note, I'm going to end. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Enjoyed it.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Take care, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.